As we wait for the election results to come in, it's important to look back at past historical elections. In this 5-part series, we will be showcasing 5 U.S. elections that had significant bearing on our nation's history. In 1789, the election of George Washington signified the birth of the American Republic. Washington ran unopposed, was unanimously elected, and throughout his presidency, Washington set the standard for what the executive power should look like.
You have George Washington as the natural choice for president. Washington is the president of the Constitutional Convention. Washington is the hero of the American War for Independence, the savior at Valley Forge, the man who rode across the Delaware to defeat the British, the man who defeats the British, who takes Cornwallis's sword at Yorktown. He's somebody that everybody respects. He is, even as early as 1788, he's accepted as the father of our country.
At that time, that is the first free election in the nation's history, the first free election in world history. The Constitution had just been ratified. In fact, Washington is inaugurated before 2 states had even ratified the Constitution, North Carolina and Rhode Island. He is unanimously selected. John Adams comes in second, so he is the vice president. This is back before the introduction of the 12th Amendment, where the runner-up would come in. The runner-up who came in second would be vice president.
It's a time, and it's going to continue until the early 20th century, where the office calls the candidate. It's not a case of, gee, I'd like to be president, or gee, you'd like to be president. It's rather that the country, the office of the presidency, reaches out and says, we need you to run. And I don't think Washington particularly wanted to be president. I think it was a case of the office, the Constitution, the public said, we need you, and he was willing to do this again.
Washington was unanimously selected for the presidency with 69 votes from the Electoral College. While in office, Washington helped to lead America along the path that the founders set forth in the Constitution. He had a major role in the creation of the Bill of Rights and helped pass several constitutional amendments.
I think the most important thing for Washington is that he establishes the office of the presidency. There's no guarantee that this new form of government is going to survive. The Articles of Confederation lasted for, what, 6 years, 8 years? Why assume that this is going to last any longer? So what Washington does is create an aura around the presidency. It's not the Oval Office because the White House hasn't been built yet. But Washington, the one thing that he does, and does exceptionally well, is somehow transfer the respect that the public has for him to the office of the presidency.
Washington set many of the traditions for the executive office that were not explicitly laid out in the newly ratified Constitution. In fact, he was responsible for creating many of the standards that are still exhibited by the executive today.
You know, Washington is well known for sort of establishing many of the precedents of the modern presidency, because no one really knew how this government in general, and specifically the presidency, was going to operate in practice. The only thing we had to go on was the text of the Constitution, which is a rather short document in comparison to other constitutions. Article 2 lays out the powers of the presidency, but what this would actually look like on the ground was quite a different matter. Nobody knew. So some of the precedents that Washington ends up setting, for example, the Constitution says something about the oath of office that the president must take. I swear to solemnly defend, protect the Constitution of the United States. But Washington added in his inauguration in New York, by the way, he's inaugurated in New York, he added to the very end of it, "So help me God." So help me God. He added 4 words. Those words don't appear in the original oath in the Constitution, but every president since has added those words at the end.
With Washington tasked as being the first president of the new republic, he was forced to navigate through unknown territory. The future of the United States was largely in Washington's hands.
Figure without that central uniting figure for the country, the ratification of the Constitution would have been impossible, which means that free elections would have been, if not impossible, highly impracticable with the absence of George Washington under those circumstances. That election essentially answered the question that Alexander Hamilton had posed in Federalist 1, that societies of men really are capable of establishing good government for themselves by reflection and choice, that they are not forever destined to depend for their political constitutions upon accident and force.
He recognizes that he is not an expert in everything, and he needs advisors. So he establishes a cabinet. There's nothing in the Constitution that says he can or should do this. And he picks people like Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton for his Secretary of the Treasury. So he's taking advice from people who are far more skilled in those particular areas, and that allows him a broader perspective on what should be right, what should be done.
Washington was re-elected to office in 1792. He ran against Vice President John Adams and New York Governor George Clinton. Neither Adams nor Clinton, however, were expected to defeat Washington, and ultimately it resulted in a race for the vice presidency. Washington won by a landslide, launching him into his second term. However, Washington would gladly relinquish this power at the end of his next 4 years.
He relinquishes his power after 2 terms. He is reelected for a second term, serves for 8 years, and then voluntarily steps aside. That was not required under the Constitution at the time, of course, and it wouldn't be until the introduction of the 22nd Amendment in the mid-20th century. But Washington establishes that precedent of a president only serving 2 terms, which will go unbroken up until FDR.
George Washington's presidency helped to establish much of the America we still see today. He helped prove to the world that a government by the people, for the people, in fact could work. Washington relinquished his power after 8 years and set the standard for presidencies to come.